The wedding had clinking champagne glasses, soft string music, and the sound of silk dresses. For Clara Evans, it was full of everything she was not. She felt like a regular sparrow that had accidentally flown into a cage of fancy peacocks. The bride, her childhood friend, had told her to come, but every other guest seemed to think she didn't belong there. Her simple store-bought dress, the nicest thing she owned, felt like it showed how poor she was under the weight of so many judging stares. She sat alone at a table near the back, completely by herself in a sea of rich people. Whispers floated toward her like poison arrows. "Did you see her dress? It looks like something my maid would wear on her day off." Completely alone. How awful. The embarrassment was a slow burn, a rising heat in her cheeks. It reached its worst when a thin, rich woman with diamonds hanging from her ears and a mean smile walked over to her table. "Oh, hello," the woman said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. "Are you lost? The staff entrance is around the back." The insult was so direct, so perfectly aimed that it took Clara's breath away. The room spun for a moment. She was about to run, to escape from this fancy hall and never come back. Her chair scraped against the floor as she prepared to stand, her pride in pieces. That's when a shadow fell over her table. A man sat down in the empty chair beside her, his presence so strong it seemed to pull all the air from around them. He was impossibly handsome, with sharp, smart features, piercing gray eyes, and a suit so perfectly fitted it looked like it had been made just for his athletic body. He was Dr. Adrian Sterling, the city's most famous plastic surgeon, a man whose cold perfectness was as legendary as his billion-dollar fortune. Clara recognized him from the society pages she sometimes looked at while waiting in line at the grocery store. He ignored the staring rich woman completely. He leaned in close to Clara, his cologne a subtle, wonderful scent of bergamot and cedar. His voice was a low, secret whisper meant only for her. "Pretend you're with me." Clara stared at him, confused. "What?" His eyes flickered toward a corner of the room, where an older, perfectly dressed woman was steering a young heiress in their direction. "My aunt is about to attack," he explained, his voice a smooth, cool murmur against her ear. "I need something to stop her. You look like you need a rescue. Help me, and I'll guide you through this shark tank for the rest of the night. Deal?" He was offering her a shield, a way out of her embarrassment. Desperate for any escape, she could only nod, her throat too tight to speak. A slow, satisfied smile touched the corner of his lips. "Good girl." With a deliberate, smooth motion, Adrian reached out and placed his hand on the small of her back. It wasn't a gentle touch. It was firm, possessive, a clear, undeniable claim. A jolt, hot and electric, shot through her at the contact. Across the room, conversation stopped. The whispers died. The rich woman who had insulted her stared, her mouth hanging open before running away. Everyone was watching. Dr. Adrian Sterling had chosen his partner for the evening. The energy between them was instant, a crackling, dangerous current. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs. She had no idea what she had just agreed to, but one thing was certain. The game had begun. If you're enjoying this story, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. 3 days after the wedding, the bell above the door of the Daily Grind, the simple cafe where Clara worked, rang. The entire place seemed to fall silent. Dr. Adrian Sterling stood in the doorway, his perfect, expensive suit and commanding presence as out of place as a panther in a petting zoo. The scent of old coffee and baked goods was instantly overpowered by the feeling of wealth and power that surrounded him. He wasn't here for a latte. His gray eyes scanned the room and landed on her, a predator spotting its prey. He walked directly to the small table she was wiping down, ignoring the stunned stares of the other customers. "Miss Evans," he said, his voice a low rumble that was somehow perfectly clear over the hiss of the espresso machine. "We need to talk." He led her to a corner booth, the worn vinyl groaning under his weight. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "I have a problem," he began, his tone crisp and clinical. "My family, and more importantly, the board of directors at my hospital, have become insistent that I settle down. They believe a stable personal life makes me look reliable. It's old-fashioned, but it's the world I work in." He paused, his gaze intense. "I need a partner for social and corporate events for the next 6 months. Someone who is smart, presentable, and most importantly, unimpressed by my money. Someone who can play a role convincingly. Clara stared at him, confused. Why are you telling me this? Because you, Miss Evans, fit the criteria, he stated simply. At the wedding you were out of your depth, but you weren't starstruck. You were proud, and when I offered you a deal, you took it. You're a pragmatist. A cold dread began to creep up Clara's spine. What do you want from me? I did some research on you, he continued, completely unfazed. The statement was chilling in its casual admission of power. I know about your mother's illness. I know about the medical debt that is slowly crushing your family. I know you work 2 jobs and are still barely keeping your head above water. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto hers. I am offering you a solution, a transaction. He named a figure, a sum so huge it made Clara's head spin. It was enough to change everything. I will settle every cent of your family's medical debt, he said, his voice even and measured. Furthermore, I will have your mother transferred to my hospital under the care of the best specialists in the country, with all expenses covered. She will receive the best treatment money can buy. The offer was a lifeline, a miracle she had prayed for in her darkest moments. But she knew there was a price. In exchange, he said, for the next 6 months, you will play the part of my fiancée. The room tilted. His fiancée? It was insane, a fantasy, but the desperation in her heart was real. The chance to save her mother, to lift the crushing weight of debt from her family's shoulders. It was everything. You think I can just pretend to be your fiancé? She whispered, the words feeling foreign and absurd on her tongue. I am a plastic surgeon, Miss Evans. I create illusions for a living. This is no different, he replied coolly. You will be paid handsomely for your performance. She felt trapped, a fly caught in a web spun from money and desperation. But it was a web that offered salvation. How could she refuse? Seeing the surrender in her eyes, Adrian reached into his suit jacket and produced a slim, leather-bound folder, placing it on the table between them. I took the liberty of having my lawyers draft an agreement, he said. Clara opened it. It was a contract, dozens of pages long, filled with dense legal language, non-disclosure agreements, behavior clauses, termination conditions. Read the rules, Miss Evans, Adrian said, his voice dropping, becoming a low, serious warning. Pay special attention to Article 7, Section B, the clause regarding non-involvement. There are to be no emotional attachments, no romantic delusions. This is a business arrangement, nothing more. He stood up, his towering presence once again commanding the small space. My driver will pick you up tomorrow at noon. Have your things ready. He turned and walked out of the cafe, leaving Clara alone in the booth with the contract and the impossible choice she had already made. She was about to sell 6 months of her life to a cold, calculating billionaire. But in doing so, she might just save the one life that mattered most to her. The next day, a sleek black car, silent as a shadow, arrived to collect her. It transported her from her world of worn-out furniture and the constant worry of overdue bills to Adrian's. His penthouse was less a home and more a monument to wealth and control. It occupied the top 2 floors of the city's most exclusive skyscraper, a fortress of glass, steel and polished marble that offered breathtaking views of the world below. It was magnificent, minimalist, and as cold and empty as a tomb. She was greeted at the door, not by Adrian, but by a stern, rail-thin woman in her late 50s, with her hair pulled back in a bun so tight it seemed to pull her face taut. I am Mrs. Davenport, Dr. Sterling's head of household, the woman announced, her voice crisp and without warmth. She looked Clara up and down, her gaze lingering on Clara's simple suitcase, and her disapproval was a real force. The doctor is in surgery. I will show you to your quarters. The tour was brief and clinical. Mrs. Davenport pointed out the kitchen, the living areas, and finally Clara's room. It was beautiful, of course, with a stunning view, but it was pointedly located at the opposite end of the sprawling penthouse from the master suite. A clear, unspoken boundary. Dr. Sterling has had a wardrobe prepared for you, Mrs. Davenport said, opening a door to reveal a walk-in closet the size of Clara's entire bedroom back home. It was filled with designer clothes, shoes, and handbags, all in her size. The sheer amount of it was staggering, proof of the thoroughness of Adrian's research. "You represent him now," the housekeeper said, her tone echoing Adrian's own words. "You are expected to dress accordingly." Left alone, Clara felt an overwhelming sense of being lost. She was a ghost haunting someone else's life. That night, sleep was impossible. The silence of the penthouse was more deafening than the city noise she was used to. Tossing and turning in the ridiculously comfortable bed, she finally gave up. A glass of water was what she needed. She walked barefoot through the dark, silent halls, guided by the glow of the city lights outside. As she entered the kitchen, she froze. He was there. Adrian stood in front of the floor-to-ceiling window, a glass of water in his hand, staring out at the glittering cityscape. He was shirtless. The moonlight showed off his body, defining the lean, powerful muscles of his back and shoulders. The body of a man who applied the same discipline to his own body as he did to everything else in his life. He must have heard her sharp intake of breath because he turned. His grey eyes, dark and unreadable in the dim light, met hers. "Insomnia?" he asked, his voice a low, husky rumble that vibrated through the quiet room. She could only nod, her throat suddenly dry. He set his glass down on the polished marble island and began to walk toward her, his movements slow, deliberate, predatory. He didn't stop until he had backed her up against the cold, smooth surface of the counter, trapping her. He placed a hand on either side of her, caging her in. "Or perhaps," he whispered, leaning in closer, "you were curious about the benefits not listed in the contract." His closeness was dizzying. She could feel the heat coming from his bare chest, smell the clean, masculine scent of his skin. His warm breath ghosted across her cheek as he leaned in, his lips hovering dangerously close to her ear. "Don't make the mistake of thinking this is anything more than what it is," he murmured, his voice a silken threat. Just as she thought he might kiss her, he pushed himself away, a mocking, cruel smirk playing on his lips. "Remember the rules, Clara," he said, his voice returning to its cool, detached tone. "Don't get attached." He picked up his glass, downed the rest of the water, and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was breathless, humiliated, and to her absolute horror, dangerously, undeniably attracted to him. In that moment, she realized the greatest danger of this contract wasn't the prying eyes of high society or the risk of being discovered. It was the cold, calculating and devastatingly attractive man who had written the rules, and she was trapped in his fortress with him. Their first public test came a week later. It was the hospital's annual charity ball, the most important social event of the year for the city's medical and philanthropic elite. It was also, Adrian informed her with a casual coldness, the place where his ex-fiancée, Victoria Lancaster, would undoubtedly be in attendance. "Your job tonight is simple," he instructed her as they stood in his cavernous living room, preparing to leave. He adjusted his cufflinks, his eyes meeting hers in the reflection of a large mirror. "You will convince everyone in that room, especially her, that you are the only woman I see." He then led her to the closet he had prepared for her. He bypassed the elegant blacks and sophisticated navies, his hand going directly to a specific gown. It was a show-stopping dress of scarlet silk that clung to every curve before flaring out at the floor. It was bold, provocative, and utterly breathtaking. "This one," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. When she emerged from the dressing room wearing it, the air in the room changed. Adrian, who had been looking at his watch, went completely still. His eyes, cool and grey, slowly travelled from her face down the column of her throat, over the lines of the dress, and back up again. The clinical detachment was gone, replaced by something darker, more primal, a flicker of raw, possessive desire. He walked toward her, his movements fluid and silent. He stopped directly in front of her, so close she could feel the heat of his body. He reached out, his fingers brushing her bare shoulder as he adjusted a strap that didn't need adjusting. His touch was like a brand, a spark that sent a shiver down her spine. "Perfect," he whispered, his voice a low, husky growl. "I want everyone to see what's mine tonight." The words were a calculated part of their act. yet they landed with the weight of a possessive truth, blurring the line between performance and reality before the night had even begun. At the ball, Clara felt like she was in a movie. With Adrian at her side, his hand firmly on her back, the disdainful whispers were replaced by looks of envy and curiosity. He guided her through the crowd, a king showing off his new queen. The inevitable confrontation happened near the champagne fountain. Adrian was pulled into a conversation with the hospital chairman, leaving Clara alone for a moment. A woman with honey blonde hair and a smile as sharp as broken glass glided up to her. "Victoria Lancaster, enjoying the view from the top?" Victoria asked, her voice sweet as artificial sweetener. "It's a long way to fall. You should enjoy it while it lasts." Clara stiffened. "I'm sorry. Have we met?" "Oh, we don't need to have met," Victoria said with a venomous little laugh. "I know his type. He loves a project. A shiny new toy. But Adrian gets bored very, very quickly. I should know." Before Clara could respond, an arm wrapped around her waist, pulling her back against a hard, familiar chest. "Victoria," Adrian's voice was a blade of ice, "I don't believe you've been properly introduced to my fiancé." He didn't wait for Victoria's reply. He turned his head and pressed a kiss to Clara's temple, a deliberate, lingering gesture of ownership. It was a public marking of his territory, a move meant as much for Victoria's benefit as it was for Clara's. He looked down at Clara, his eyes burning with a protective fire that stunned her into silence. The look was not part of the act. It was real. "Darling," he murmured, his lips close to her ear. "Shall we dance?" He led her to the dance floor, leaving Victoria standing alone, her perfect smile frozen on her face. As he pulled Clara into his arms, she was acutely aware of the strength in his hands, the intensity of his gaze, and the shocking, undeniable truth that his pretend protection had felt more real than anything she had experienced all night. The following week, Adrian took her to a high-stakes art auction. It was another battlefield in his world, where power was displayed not through words, but through the casual raising of a numbered paddle. Clara, a former art history student, felt a pang of longing as she looked at the magnificent works on display. It was a life she had dreamed of, now being shown to her as part of a fantasy she was being paid to perform. She found herself captivated by a particular painting, a moody, atmospheric landscape by an emerging artist. She mentioned her admiration for it in a quiet whisper to Adrian. He simply nodded, his expression unreadable. When the painting came up for auction, the bidding was spirited. It quickly escalated between two parties. One was Adrian. The other was a man a few rows ahead of them, a notoriously ruthless real estate developer named Marcus Thorne. He was older, with a leering glint in his eye and a reputation for crushing his competitors. The price climbed higher and higher. Just as Adrian was about to place a final winning bid, he paused. He glanced at Clara, then back at Thorne, and with a subtle, almost imperceptible shake of his head, he withdrew. The gavel came down. The painting was sold to Marcus Thorne. Clara was confused and a little disappointed. Later, during a lull in the auction, Thorne approached them, a smug smile on his face. "Dr. Sterling," he said, nodding at Adrian before his eyes landed on Clara, lingering for a moment too long. "A pleasure to see you." He then turned his full, unwelcome attention to Clara. "I couldn't help but notice your admiration for my new acquisition, a woman with exquisite taste." His gaze roamed over her body in a way that made her skin crawl. "Perhaps we could discuss art sometime in a more private setting." The air grew cold. Adrian, who had been the picture of calm indifference, went rigid. He didn't say a word to Thorne. He didn't even look at him. Instead, he turned to Clara. He placed a hand on the nape of her neck, his fingers tangling in the soft hairs there, and pulled her toward him. And then he kissed her. It wasn't a gentle romantic kiss. It wasn't the chaste public peck he had given her at the ball. This was a raw, hungry, and deeply possessive kiss. It was a brand, a claim, a silent, furious declaration made in front of a room full of the city's most powerful people. It was a kiss that said without a single word, "She is mine." The crowded room seemed to fall silent. Clara's mind went blank, all thought obliterated by the shocking, overwhelming sensation of his lips on hers. Her hands came up to clutch at his suit jacket, her body melting against his. When he finally pulled away, his breath was ragged, his eyes burning into hers with a fire that had nothing to do with their contract. "We're leaving," he commanded, his voice a low growl. He took her hand, his grip firm, and led her out of the auction house, leaving Marcus Thorne standing there speechless and publicly humiliated. The silence in the car on the way back to the penthouse was heavy and suffocating. Clara stared out the window, her lips still tingling, her mind reeling. She could feel his eyes on her, but she couldn't bring herself to look at him. "What was that?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling. The car glided to a stop in the underground garage. He turned off the engine, plunging them into a sudden, profound silence. "No one," he said, his voice a low, dangerous blade in the dark, "disrespects what is mine." The words should have terrified her. They were possessive, controlling. The words of a man who saw her as a possession, but to her horror, buried deep beneath the fear, a treacherous, thrilling warmth spread through her veins. He had defended her, he had claimed her, and it had felt terrifyingly, intoxicatingly real. A violent thunderstorm rolled into the city a few nights later, trapping them in the penthouse. The wind howled like a wounded animal, and rain hammered against the panoramic windows, obscuring the glittering city below in a grey, turbulent sheet. Then, with a flicker and a groan, the power grid gave out. The penthouse was plunged into immediate inky blackness. "Stay put," Adrian's voice commanded from across the living room, calm and steady in the sudden dark. A moment later, his phone's flashlight cut a sharp beam through the black. He moved with an unhurried grace, lighting thick, scented candles he retrieved from a cabinet, placing them around the room. The space was soon filled with a warm, flickering glow, the shadows dancing on the walls like ancient ghosts. The storm had severed their connection to the outside world, isolating them completely. The cold, cavernous penthouse suddenly felt small, intimate. The carefully constructed boundaries of their arrangement seemed to dissolve in the candlelight. "I suppose a drink is in order," Adrian said, his voice softer than usual. He retrieved a bottle of aged whiskey and 2 crystal glasses, the amber liquid catching the candlelight as he poured. He handed a glass to her, their fingers brushing for a fraction of a second too long. They sat in silence for a while, the only sounds the roar of the storm outside and the soft crackle of the candle wicks. The whiskey was smooth and warm, a welcome heat that spread through Clara's chest, loosening the knot of anxiety that was perpetually tied there. "You're not afraid of storms," he observed. It wasn't a question. "No," she admitted. "My mother always said they were just the sky rearranging its furniture. It made them seem less scary." She took another sip of whiskey. "How is she?" "I spoke to her nurse yesterday, but she's responding well to the new treatment," Adrian said, his voice turning clinical for a moment. "Her vitals are stable. The oncology team is cautiously optimistic." He paused. "You miss her?" Again, not a question. "Every day," Clara whispered. The conversation drifted, becoming dangerously personal in the enforced intimacy of the blackout. She asked him about his work, the pressure, the godlike responsibility of holding a life in his hands. He in turn asked about her art, the passion she had been forced to set aside. Then, emboldened by the whiskey and the strange confessional atmosphere, she asked the question she had been wanting to ask since the night of the ball. What happened with Victoria? Adrian went still. He stared into the dancing flame of the candle, his jaw tight. For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. "She cheated on me," he said finally, the words stark and stripped of emotion. "With my best friend, the man who was supposed to be my best man at our wedding." He took a long swallow of his whiskey. "It wasn't the infidelity that broke me," he continued, his voice raw with a pain he rarely allowed to surface. "It was the deception. The months of lies, the realization that the two people I trusted most in the world saw me as a fool, an obstacle, a bank account. He finally looked at her, and in the flickering candlelight, his mask of cold control was gone. She saw only a man who had been profoundly wounded, a man who had encased his heart in ice to prevent it from ever being shattered again. I swore then, he admitted, his voice barely a whisper, that I would never let anyone get close enough to hurt me again. In that moment, he wasn't Dr. Adrian Sterling, the billionaire surgeon. He was just a man, vulnerable and in pain. Instinctively, without thinking, Clara reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on the table. The contact was like a lightning strike. His head snapped up, his eyes locking onto hers. He stared down at her small hand covering his, a look of shock on his face. The air grew thick, charged with a sudden, overwhelming electricity. He turned his hand over, his fingers lacing with hers. Slowly, deliberately, he leaned in. There were no games this time, no mockery in his eyes, only a raw, unguarded need that mirrored her own. The kiss was inevitable, a foregone conclusion written in the tension that had been building between them for weeks. His lips were inches from hers, his breath warm on her skin. A deafening crack of thunder exploded directly overhead, so loud and violent it shook the very foundations of the building. They both jumped, startled, the spell shattering into a million pieces. The moment was broken. Adrian pulled his hand back as if he'd been burned, the mask of cool indifference sliding back into place. He stood up abruptly, turning away from her. "It's late," he said, his voice strained. "You should get some rest." He walked out of the room, leaving her alone in the candlelight, her heart hammering against her ribs. The promise of the kiss, unspoken and unfulfilled, hung in the air between them, more powerful and more dangerous than if it had ever happened. The unspoken kiss from the night of the storm became a ghost that haunted the penthouse. A fragile, awkward truce settled between them. Adrian was more withdrawn than ever, throwing himself into his work with a renewed intensity, as if trying to outrun the vulnerability he had shown. Clara, in turn, tried to make herself as invisible as possible, her heart aching with the memory of what had almost been. The fragile peace was shattered by a phone call a week later. It was the hospital. Clara's mother had developed a severe post-treatment infection and had been rushed into intensive care. She needed an immediate high-risk surgical procedure to have any chance of survival. Clara's world imploded. She was a mess of panic and tears when Adrian found her, having been alerted by his staff. He took one look at her terrified face, listened to the frantic explanation, and his entire demeanor shifted. The cold, distant billionaire vanished, replaced by the decisive, commanding surgeon. "She's in the best hands, but I'm going in," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'll do the surgery myself. Now go to the hospital. I'll meet you there." He was already shrugging off his suit jacket, his mind focused, his purpose absolute. Hours later, Clara was pacing the sterile white floor of the surgical waiting area, a hollowed-out shell of anxiety. She was a wreck, unable to think, unable to breathe. She needed to call her family, but her mother's important legal and insurance documents were back at the penthouse. She remembered her mother mentioning a durable power of attorney, something the hospital administration might need. She called Adrian's personal line, a number he had given her for emergencies, expecting to get his voicemail. He answered on the first ring, his voice calm and steady from the other side of the operating room doors. "Clara, what is it?" "I'm so sorry to bother you," she sobbed, "but I need documents for my mom. They're at the penthouse." "I don't know what to do." "My office," he said without hesitation. "In the wall behind the abstract painting there's a safe. The code is 1805, the year of the Battle of Trafalgar." A strangely personal detail. "The documents you need for the hospital are in a blue folder. Just take that folder. Do not touch anything else." The line went dead. Armed with the code and a desperate sense of purpose, she took a taxi back to the silent penthouse. Her hands trembled as she swung the painting aside and entered the code. The heavy steel door of the safe swung open. Inside, everything was meticulously organized. Stacks of papers, deeds, a few pieces of jewelry in velvet boxes, and there, just as he'd said, was a simple blue folder. She pulled it out, but as she did, her eyes caught on the folder beneath it. It was thick, black, and unmarked, except for a small typed label on the tab. Her breath caught in her throat. The name on the label was Marcus Thorne. Her mind screamed at her to close the safe, to obey Adrian's command, but she couldn't. Her fingers, acting on their own, pulled the folder out. It wasn't a business portfolio. It was a full-blown private investigation file. She sank into Adrian's leather desk chair, her heart pounding, and began to read. The file was a deep dive into the life of the leering man from the art auction. It detailed his predatory business practices, listing small family-owned companies he had systematically driven into bankruptcy before buying their assets for pennies on the dollar. It was a graveyard of ruined dreams. Then she turned a page and saw a name that made her blood run cold. Lancaster Textiles, Victoria's family business. According to the investigator's report, Thorne had orchestrated its downfall 1.5 years ago. At the very back of the file, tucked into a sleeve, was a single handwritten note on Adrian's personal stationery. It was a question scrawled in his sharp, decisive handwriting. A question he had clearly been asking himself. As a victim of Victoria's infidelity, he had been actively investigating the man who may have been the root cause of it all. He suspected Victoria hadn't just left him. She had been pushed, perhaps, by financial desperation caused by Marcus Thorne. The cold, heartless man he pretended to be was a facade. Beneath the ice, there was a man who felt guilty, a man who sought to understand, a man who pursued a quiet, hidden form of justice. Who was the real Adrian Sterling? The question echoed in the silent, empty office. She had signed a contract with a man she thought she understood, but she was living with a complete and utter stranger. Clara sat in the sterile silence of the hospital waiting room, the weight of the black folder a tangible presence in her bag. Her mother was out of surgery and stable, resting in a private recovery room. Adrian had done it. He had saved her. He had walked out of the operating room hours ago, his face tired but calm, and given her the news with a quiet, professional reassurance before disappearing to handle other hospital matters. Now he was walking toward her, having shed his surgical scrubs for a crisp dress shirt and slacks. He looked exhausted, but his posture was still perfectly straight. "She's doing well," he said, his voice soft. "The next 24 hours are critical, but I'm confident she'll make a full recovery." "Thank you, Adrian," Clara said, her voice thick with a gratitude so immense it felt like it could swallow her whole. "I don't know how I can ever." "It's part of our arrangement," he cut in, his professional mask sliding back into place. It was a reflexive defense, a way to keep the wall between them intact. But Clara wouldn't allow it. Not anymore. She took a deep breath. "We need to talk. Not about my mother. About Marcus Thorne." Adrian froze. His calm, clinical demeanor evaporated, replaced by a guarded stillness. His eyes, which had been soft with fatigue, turned sharp and hard as flint. "You violated my trust," he said, his voice dangerously low. "I gave you one instruction." "You left out a few key details in your story the other night," she countered, her own voice gaining a strength she didn't know she possessed. She pulled the folder from her bag and placed it on the empty chair between them. "You told me Victoria cheated on you. You didn't tell me you suspected she was driven into another man's arms by financial ruin orchestrated by Thorne. You didn't tell me you were investigating him." She looked him straight in the eye, her gaze unwavering. "You're still trying to protect her, aren't you? Even after all this time, do you still love her?" The question hung in the air, raw and direct. Adrian stared at the folder, then back at her, a muscle working in his jaw. He looked like a king whose fortress had just been breached. He let out a long, weary sigh, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair, messing it up for the first time she had ever seen. "No," he said, the word heavy with a truth he rarely admitted even to himself. I don't love her. Not anymore, but I feel responsible. He finally met her gaze, and the ice in his eyes had melted, revealing a deep well of guilt. I was obsessed with my work. I was cold, demanding. I saw her family's financial trouble as a nuisance, not a crisis. I thought she left me for my best friend because I wasn't enough. It took me months to realize I hadn't been paying attention, that I had pushed her away long before she ever strayed. I drove her to a point of desperation where another man's comfort and money seemed like a better option. My investigation, it started as a way to confirm my own failures. Clara listened, her heart aching for him. He wasn't a vengeful ex-lover. He was a man punishing himself, carrying a burden of guilt far heavier than she had ever imagined. An idea bold and reckless began to form in her mind. An idea born of her gratitude, her newfound understanding of him, and a simmering anger of her own. You want justice for what he did to her, Clara said, her voice firm and clear. I want justice for what men like him do to families like mine, the ones they crush without a second thought. She leaned forward, her eyes alight with a fierce, determined fire. So let's stop circling the truth and do something about it. Let's get him together. Adrian stared at her, utterly speechless. He was completely taken back. This quiet, unassuming woman he had hired to be a pretty, silent accessory was now proposing to be his partner in a dangerous battle against a powerful enemy. She wasn't asking for his protection. She was offering her alliance. For the first time, he saw her not as a contract, not as a charity case, not as a complicated woman who made him feel things he didn't want to feel. He saw her as an equal, a warrior. A slow, dangerous smile spread across his face. The first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. It transformed his entire demeanor. All right, Evans, he said, the name now sounding less like a formal address and more like the name of a respected partner. Let's go to work. The penthouse transformed from a cold residence into a strategic war room. For the first time, Clara and Adrian were not circling each other as employer and employee, but collaborating as partners. The shift was seismic. They spent hours huddled over the investigation file, piecing together Thorne's patterns, his weaknesses, his ego. The plan they devised was audacious, relying on Thorne's two greatest weaknesses, his greed and his lechery. The trap would be set at a private, high-stakes investment summit Thorne was hosting for a select group of potential clients. Clara, armed with the intricate financial knowledge from Adrian's file and a new flawlessly fabricated identity, would play the part of Clara Beaumont, the sole heiress to a recently acquired European tech fortune. Her goal, to dangle the prospect of a massive 9-figure investment so enticing that Thorne would drop his guard. He'll be expecting a seasoned investor, not someone like you, Adrian explained, pacing his office. You're his blind spot. Young, beautiful, and supposedly incredibly rich. You are everything his ego wants to conquer. The night of the summit, the tension was a live wire. Clara looked the part, dressed in a sophisticated emerald green gown that screamed old money. But beneath the designer fabric, her heart was hammering. Adrian wouldn't be by her side. He would be watching from a remote surveillance van parked down the street, communicating with her through a nearly invisible earpiece. You'll be fine, he said, his voice a low murmur as he fitted the earpiece for her. His fingers brushed against her skin, a brief, warm touch that sent a shiver through her. You're a natural. Just remember the mission. The mission. It felt a world away as she stepped into the lavish hotel ballroom alone. But as she saw Marcus Thorne holding court, a smug predator in his element, her resolve hardened. She took a deep breath and transformed into Clara Beaumont. She played her role perfectly. She was aloof, intelligent, slightly bored by the display of wealth around her. She let Thorne come to her. When he did, she engaged him in a sharp, knowledgeable conversation about market trends and investment yields, dropping just enough information from Adrian's file to establish her credibility. Thorne was hooked. You have a brilliant mind, Miss Beaumont, he purred, his eyes lingering on her. I'm more interested in brilliant returns, Mr. Thorne, she replied coolly. Through the earpiece, Adrian's voice was a steady, reassuring presence. Good, he's taking the bait. Keep him focused on the numbers. The game was working. Thorne, convinced he was on the verge of landing the biggest investment of his career, grew bolder. A deal of this magnitude requires a more private discussion, My private suite is just upstairs. We can go over the final details there." A cold knot of fear tightened in Clara's stomach. This was the most dangerous part of the plan. "Clara, it's your call." Adrian's voice came through the earpiece, tight with concern. "You don't have to go." "I'm fine," she whispered under her breath before giving Thorne a dazzling smile. "Lead the way, Mr. Thorne." The suite was opulent and suffocating. As Thorne poured them both a drink, his demeanor shifted. The professional charm fell away, revealing the lecher beneath. "You know," he said, moving closer to her on the sofa, "you remind me of someone. A little waitress, fiery proud. I wonder whatever happened to her." Clara's blood ran cold. He was playing with her. Did he know? He reached out, his hand closing around her wrist. "You have the same eyes," he said, his voice a low growl, his grip tightening. "Tell me, Miss Beaumont, what's a lovely girl like you really doing here?" He knew. The ruse was up. "Clara, get out of there now." Adrian's voice was a roar in her ear, filled with raw panic. "Say the safe word. Get out." But before she could speak, Thorne's other hand clamped down on her arm. "I don't think you're going anywhere." The heavy suite door clicked shut. The sound of the lock engaging echoed like a death knell. She was trapped, alone, and the voice in her ear had gone silent. The moment the door clicked shut, the calm, strategic Dr. Sterling in the surveillance van vanished, and a primal, furious man took his place. He ripped the headset off, his face a mask of cold rage. He was out of the van and sprinting toward the hotel entrance before his security team could even react. He didn't wait for an elevator, taking the stairs to the penthouse suite 2 at a time, his mind a roaring tempest of fear and fury. Inside the suite, Thorne's smug smile widened. "Now where were we?" he said, his grip on Clara's arm like a vice. Clara's fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was quickly being consumed by a white-hot anger. She was no longer the timid girl from the wedding. She met his gaze, her chin held high. "Let go of me," she said, her voice dangerously steady. "I don't think so," Thorne sneered. "You and your doctor friend have caused me a great deal of trouble." Suddenly, the suite door burst open, splintering off its hinges as if it had been hit by a battering ram. Adrian stood there, his chest heaving, his eyes burning with a terrifying, murderous light. He was no longer the calm surgeon. He was a predator whose mate was being threatened, and his entire being radiated lethal intent. He didn't rush or shout. He walked into the room, his movements eerily calm, which was far more frightening than any outburst would have been. "Thorne," Adrian said, his voice a low, deadly growl. "You have 5 seconds to take your hands off her." Thorne, seeing the look in Adrian's eyes, instinctively released Clara. She scrambled away, putting distance between herself and the 2 men. "This is a private conversation, Sterling," Thorne blustered, trying to regain some semblance of control. "It's over," Adrian said, stopping a few feet from him. "My lawyers have been listening to and recording every word you've said for the past hour. They've already filed a preliminary injunction with the SEC based on your admission of market manipulation. By morning, your assets will be frozen. You, Marcus, are ruined." Thorne's face went from red to a pasty, sickly white. He was finished. Adrian walked over to Clara, his eyes scanning her for any sign of injury. His hand came up to her arm, his grip firm but infinitely gentle, a stark contrast to Thorne's bruising hold. "Let's go," he said softly. He led her out of the suite, past the hotel security, who were now rushing to the scene, and didn't stop until they were in the silent, sterile environment of the underground parking garage. The adrenaline from the confrontation drained away, leaving behind a raw, trembling, emotional aftermath. They stood by his car, the air thick with unspoken words. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "I'm fine," she whispered, though she was shaking. He reached out, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb stroking away a tear she didn't even know had fallen. His composure finally broke. The fear he had suppressed now flooded his features, making him look vulnerable and achingly human. "I thought I was going to lose you," he confessed, his voice cracking with an emotion she had never heard from him before. "When the audio cut out, when you were in there with him in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not the money, not the revenge, not the contract, nothing. Only you." The confession hung in the air, raw and undeniable. It was the truth stripped of all artifice and games. He stopped the car, not at the penthouse, but a block away from her old, humble apartment building. He turned to her, his face a mask of profound, heartbreaking resignation. "The contract is broken, Clara," he said quietly. "It's over. You're free. I'll continue to take care of your mother's expenses. That was never in question, but you don't have to be tied to me anymore." He wouldn't look at her. He was letting her go. It was the final, most painful act of love he could offer, believing it was what she truly wanted. He was setting her free, even if it meant losing the only thing he had just admitted mattered. "Go be happy, Clara," he whispered, his voice thick with unshed tears. "You deserve it." Clara walked into her old apartment, and the familiar scent of her life before Adrian, lavender air freshener and old books, felt alien. The freedom she had once craved now felt like a vast, echoing emptiness. The small, cramped rooms that had once been her entire world now felt like a cage, far more confining than Adrian's glass fortress had ever been. The silence was the worst part. It wasn't the peaceful, contemplative silence of the penthouse library. It was a hollow, lonely silence punctuated only by the ticking of a cheap wall clock. Days turned into a week. She visited her mother at the hospital, a state-of-the-art facility that felt like another world. Her mother, now recovering remarkably in a sun-drenched private room, was sharp-eyed. She saw the sadness that clung to her daughter like a shadow. "You saved my life, my darling girl," her mother said one afternoon, taking Clara's hand. Her grip was stronger now. "But you look like you've lost the world. You love him, don't you?" The question was so simple, so direct. "It's complicated, Mom," Clara deflected, looking away. "No, it's not," her mother said gently. "I saw the way he looked at you when he came to check on me. That wasn't a doctor looking at a patient's daughter. That was a man looking at his entire world. So why are you here looking miserable instead of with him?" The words resonated deep in Clara's soul. She had spent the last week telling herself she was lucky to be free, that she had escaped without getting her heart completely broken. But it was a lie. Her heart was already broken, not by Adrian, but by his absence. She thought about the man she had come to know. Not the cold billionaire, but the man who carried the weight of his own guilt, who fought for a quiet justice, who had looked at her with raw terror in his eyes when he thought she was in danger, the man who had kissed her with a desperate, claiming passion, the man who had let her go, believing it was for her own good. She realized she wasn't the same frightened, insecure woman who had been humiliated at a wedding months ago. She had walked into a den of lions and emerged unscathed. She had negotiated a contract with a billionaire, played a dangerous game with a corporate predator, and won. She was no longer a victim of circumstance. She was a woman who could make her own choices, and she was choosing him. Without a second thought, she kissed her mother goodbye, left the hospital, and took a taxi straight to Sterling Tower. She used the private key card Adrian had given her, the one she was supposed to have returned, and took the elevator straight to the penthouse. She found him in his office. He was standing in front of the massive window, staring out at the city, a glass of whiskey in his hand. He looked lost, a king in a castle that had become a prison. He didn't hear her enter. "I don't want to be free," she said softly from the doorway. Adrian spun around, his eyes wide with shock and adoring, incredulous hope. He looked as if he was seeing a ghost. "Clara." "Not if it means being without you," she continued, walking slowly toward him, her heart pounding with a new, fearless certainty. "But the contract," he stammered, his composure gone. "Tear up the contract," she said, stopping just before him. She reached up, her hand cool against his cheek. "Let's write our own." And then she kissed him. It was not a kiss of gratitude or of calculated performance. It was a kiss of choice, of demand, of absolute certainty. It was the kiss she had been waiting for, the one that had been promised in the dark of the storm. For a moment he was too stunned to react. Then, with a low groan that came from the depths of his soul, he surrendered. His arms wrapped around her, lifting her off her feet and pulling her tight against him, as if he could absorb her into himself. The kiss deepened, becoming a fiery, passionate testament to all the unspoken feelings, all the pent-up longing, all the rules that were finally irrevocably broken. He was no longer her employer, and she was no longer his burden. In that moment, they were simply a man and a woman, finally claiming the love they had fought so hard to deny. 6 months later, Clara stood in a sun-dappled garden, the scent of roses and fresh-cut grass in the air. A soft breeze rustled the leaves of the ancient oak tree under which she stood. This time she was not an outsider. She was the main event. It was another wedding, but it was nothing like the ostentatious affair that had started it all. The ceremony was small, intimate, attended only by the people who truly mattered. Clara's mother, her face glowing with health and happiness, sat in the front row dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. Mrs. Davenport, the once stern housekeeper, stood beside her, a rare, genuine smile on her face. Adrian stood opposite Clara, and he was a man transformed. The cold, icy mask he had worn for so long was gone, melted away by the warmth of a love he had finally allowed himself to accept. He wore no armor today, only a perfectly tailored suit and an expression of such profound adoration that it made Clara's heart ache with joy. He only had eyes for her. When it came time for the vows, they were not the flowery generic promises of strangers. They were real, forged in the fire of their unique journey. Adrian took her hands, his grip warm and steady. "A for all my days to be worthy of the man you see in me." Tears streamed freely down Clara's face as she began her own vows. "You came into my life like a storm," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You offered me a deal to save my family, but you ended up giving me a family. You showed me a world I never thought I belonged in. And then you showed me that the only place I truly belong is by your side. I promise to always see the man behind the mask, to challenge you, to love you, and to build a life with you that is anything but pretend." Later, as the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the garden, they danced their first dance as husband and wife. It was a slow, easy dance, their bodies moving together in perfect sync. There were no prying eyes to perform for, no hidden motives, no games left to play. Adrian pulled her closer, his lips brushing against her ear. He whispered the 4 words that had started it all, but now they were imbued with a new eternal meaning. "You're with me," he murmured. Clara leaned her head against his chest, her heart full to bursting. She smiled, a radiant, joyful smile that was all her own. "Always," she whispered back.